For as long as my brother and I can remember, Pixar has been part of our lives. We've personally never known a world without these movies, and Pixar helped shape us both as writers and as people. They're honestly a huge reason we first fell in love with storytelling and its ability to make people laugh, cry, think, and understand life a little better. We grew up during Pixar's golden era when the studio was releasing hit after hit. Like seriously, this studio has one of the most legendary runs. So much so that several of their films have earned places among IMDb's highest rated movies of all time. While the studio's recent quality isn't quite as consistent as it once was, when Pixar gets it right, they really get it right. So with Toy Story 5 now joining the lineup, we thought this was the perfect time to rank all 31 Pixar films, from the original Toy Story to the 5th installment and everything in between. We rewatched every movie and ultimately came to an agreement on this list, starting with what we believe is the weakest and working our way up to the Pixar film we consider the studio's all-time best. So let's dive into every movie Pixar has given us over the last 3 decades.
Tomato, average intelligence.
So to start, at number 31 and sitting firmly in last place, we have Cars 2. This is notoriously regarded as one of Pixar's weakest films, at the very bottom for many, and honestly, we can't disagree. Coming off of the strong entry of its first film, this sequel lacks almost everything that made the original work, and more than any other Pixar film, Cars 2 barely feels like Pixar. The tone is different, the emotional core is mostly absent, and the concept itself feels far less clever or inspired than what we've come to expect from the studio. At times, it honestly even feels more like a direct-to-video spin-off than a theatrical Pixar release. And one issue Pixar has occasionally run into with its sequels is elevating a supporting character into the lead role. Sometimes it works, but more often than not, it highlights why that character was a supporting character to begin with. And that's definitely the case here. Mater is fun in small doses, but centering an entire film around him just doesn't work for me. He's a character I really enjoy in a short, a TV special, or even a theme park ride, not necessarily as the emotional anchor of a feature film. Plus, the spy storyline also feels completely disconnected from the world and themes established in the first movie. It never feels like a natural progression of the story, and rather just something that came out of left field, sidelining a Lightning McQueen arc that's so underdeveloped that it honestly feels hard to remember much about it. But to be fair, this isn't some unwatchable disaster. The Lemons are a fun villain concept, the plot moves at a decent pace, and characters like Mater and Lightning are still inherently likable even if coasting off of their good grace from the first film. But those few positives are ultimately not enough to overcome the film's larger issues, and so for us, Cars 2 lands at the very bottom of Pixar's catalog and stands as one of the studio's few genuinely bad films.
That creature protected you.
Second to last on our list at number 30 is The Good Dinosaur. With The Good Dinosaur, I've always felt that the most compelling thing in the film happens in the literal first minute when the meteor flies by, keeping the dinosaurs from going extinct. The idea of a world where dinosaurs continue to exist alongside humans could have been interesting, but the film didn't live up to the concept. Instead, it told a story that was all over the place and included Pixar's most flat and forgettable characters. The incohesive plot is also reflected in the inconsistent animation. The animated environments are beautiful visually and very realistic, while the actual characters look overly cartoony and amateur, lacking characterization in both appearance and personality. The characters, dialogue, and initial circumstances were way too generic and didn't have the depth of other Pixar films. Of Pixar's originals, it's by far the weakest written script, and especially coming out in the same year as one of Pixar's best written scripts, it made the flaws of this film stand out even more. It felt like this was a story that never got fleshed out past the initial one-dimensional storyboard, and its production issues behind the scenes leaked into the final product. The characters just say the plot aloud with zero subtext or nuance. Also, Jeffrey Wright is a great actor, but sometimes his voice as the dad, paired with the sentimental piano, felt like how a character would satirically talk in a Rick and Morty commercial. The positives were that the scenes of Arlo running through the fireflies with his dad and then with Spot were nice. The look Arlo's dad gives him before being swept away by the water is at least a bit stirring, and when Arlo and Spot connect over their family using sticks in a circle, it's a heartfelt moment. Especially when it comes back around toward the end when Spot joins humans and Arlo puts a circle around them to indicate how they're family. It was creative to have the pterodactyls looking like shark fins in the sky before they attack, and the reverse meaning of Arlo's dad saying, "Now go take care of that critter," by the end could have been extra effective if Arlo and Spot had better development. These positives just weren't enough to distract from the film's many issues that landed it this low on the list. The movie goes from overly straightforward to just a hodgepodge of random, mostly drab events. Ultimately, it felt like a movie that didn't know what it wanted to be, so it tried to be a bunch of different stories and didn't succeed at any of them. At number 29, we've got Elemental. This was the first Pixar film where, when I first watched it, I found myself checking the time halfway through to see if it was almost over. This film really didn't pull us in, and it didn't feel like a Pixar movie, but rather a middling installment from a less innovative animation studio. I've always admired the way Pixar comes up with such creative metaphors for their stories, but Elemental is their least inspired metaphor, as fire and water are one of the most basic and obvious ways to depict differences. And something about the animation style in this film just didn't work for us. Like, for a world where the four elements coexist as different species, it could have been a really cool world to visit, and yet we found the world to feel really flat and not immersive. And then there's Claude and many other elements of this film that felt pretty see-through. Like, you could sense the story wanting you to lock in without actually earning the investment. What we can appreciate is how the film aimed to shed light on the immigrant experience, and the bow between Ember and her dad was nice after he didn't get a bow from his own dad. That was the moment with the most heart in the film to me. Wade and Ember's contrasting temperaments were fine, though not developed as strongly as some of Pixar's other relationships. For being a love story, Pixar managed to tell much more compelling love stories between robots and bugs than they did with Ember and Wade. Similar to The Good Dinosaur, made by the same director, Elemental has too many moments of flat, expository dialogue where they say the plot rather than show it. And the overarching mission, conflict, and climax were all underwhelming. I did like how, rather than merely saying opposites attract, the film depicts how opposites can change chemistry. It's just the way they depict that and all their other themes left much to be desired. Overall, I felt the world didn't feel nearly as immersive and inviting as it could have, the characters weren't nearly as fleshed out as they needed to be to really sell the romance and the conflict, and the metaphors and puns were super basic. So this was a rather forgettable installment from Pixar.
I can provide sleep sounds if you like.
Coming in at number 28, we have Lightyear. And honestly, I think Pixar thought they were making their own version of Interstellar with this, but what they actually made was their version of Inception, because we're essentially watching a movie made to sell toys about a movie that was made to sell toys. And if I'm being honest, this film lost me almost immediately. Like, from the opening title cards, I just couldn't get behind the premise. I have no idea why they decided to make the audience watch a fictional movie from one of their fictional worlds. For people familiar with the Scream franchise, it'd be kinda like if instead of releasing a new Scream movie, they instead released a Stab movie and told us at the beginning in title cards that this is actually the third Stab movie from the Scream universe. And it's like not even that good of a Stab movie. It's just such a strange creative choice that it almost instantly made it harder for me to get immersed having this in the back of my head the whole time. And what's frustrating is that the film actually does start pretty strong. One thing I've always appreciated about Pixar is their willingness to embrace surprisingly mature storytelling, and Buzz repeatedly failing his mission while returning home to find that years have passed is genuinely compelling. Watching his best friend grow older, build a life, and eventually pass away while he's gone creates real emotional weight, strong stakes, and a clear thematic foundation. For a brief stretch, it actually feels like a Pixar movie. But after that, the film really falls off a cliff. The supporting cast is one of Pixar's weakest and most forgettable, with their constant goofiness often replacing actual characterization. The Zurg twist is fine in theory, but it isn't nearly strong enough to uplift the rest of the story. And my biggest issue, though, may have to be Buzz himself. Compared to the version we met in Toy Story, this Buzz feels pretty bland and generic. He's missing a lot of the personality, charm, and identity that made the original character so memorable in the first place. In fact, I think the story might have worked better as a completely original sci-fi film, but of course, an original character probably wouldn't sell as many toys as Buzz Lightyear.
I knew aliens were looking for me!
Elio takes our number 27 spot. I found Elio Solis to be a likable protagonist, and his relationship with Gordon was endearing. The humor throughout was well done, and there was some heart to this story. The idea of a kid actually wanting to be abducted because he feels there's nowhere he fits on Earth worked for me. And with the undercurrent of grief, having lost his parents and feeling like a misunderstood outcast, it was moving to see Elio accepted by the other species he meets. This film was a much more fun exploration of space than Lightyear, and while I feel early Pixar would have made the side characters much more memorable and distinct, I still felt they worked for the story, even if a bit forgettable compared to the supporting cast and better Pixar films. The Elio clone was one of the highlights, and I found his overly perfect, almost elderly vibe funny. And then they capped the film off with a nice ending showing Elio holding his aunt's hand as they emphasize how space touches on the deepest concerns of are we alone. And the film showed how Elio wasn't, as he went from lonely to loved intergalactically. For a Pixar film, this was just okay, but I think from an animation studio with less hits, this would be held in at least a bit higher regard. Elio doesn't have particularly high highs or hook you in like the stronger films on this list, which is why it's ranked lower here. But for what it is, it's a film that I'd say can best be described as satisfactory.
Did the red peony bloom? No!
At number 26, we have Turning Red. This is another one of Pixar's more underwhelming entries for me, and a film that often feels like a watered-down version of what you'd expect from the studio at its best. One issue I had right away was the film's protagonist, May. There's a tricky balance when writing intentionally awkward or annoying protagonists. Characters like Russell and Up, Barley and Onward, or Dory in Finding Nemo can be a lot, but they're still endearing to watch. With May, I often feel like the film crossed that line where the characterization stopped feeling intentionally annoying and just became annoying. But my bigger issue is actually with the choice of the protagonists. One thing I've noticed when revisiting Pixar's catalog is that many of their strongest films follow older characters, parental figures, or protagonists dealing with more mature stages of life. In watching Turning Red, I couldn't help but feel like the more interesting story there was actually May's mother. She's dealing with the same red panda spirit, carrying the influence of her own mother, and slowly realizing she's becoming the very person who shaped her. To me, that's just a far more fascinating character conflict to drive this concept and story. I don't think the mother-daughter relationship is bad, and there's clearly strong thematic material there, but it never felt specific enough to these two characters. Instead, it often felt like a more generalized, strict parent versus rebellious teen storyline. I also think the film struggles in its second act. The stakes never fully land, and while the goal of seeing the boy band is important to May, the movie never quite convinces me that the larger consequences of turning into the red panda really matter or create any real genuine suspense to keeping that secret. As a result, the plot feels notably weightless for a Pixar film. But that said, there is one moment that really works for me, and that's the scene where May guides her mother through the bamboo forest as she ages back into her present self. It's emotional, visually beautiful, and captures a kind of Pixar magic that the rest of the film just never really reaches. And I'd say that sequence alone is enough to lift Turning Red above some of the other films below it.
My senior project.
Cars 3 is number 25 on our list, and after a disappointing sequel with Cars 2, it was smart that the franchise knew to return back to its roots and focus on its original protagonist, Lightning McQueen, in Cars 3. I do like how the first Cars focuses on McQueen's ego in his prime, and Cars 3 focuses on McQueen aging out of his glory days. The racing animation has always been a strong point of the Cars franchise, and I like how they made the McQueen crash scene legitimately intense. Where Cars 2 really lacked heart, having the third one return back to the influence Doc had on McQueen grounded the movie in something deeper. Doc and McQueen's dynamic in the first Cars was one of the strongest elements, so it was nice to see McQueen meet Doc's buddies and now take on his own kind of mentor role with Cruz. McQueen got to learn that Doc found genuine fulfillment from coaching and was really proud of him, which sets up nicely how McQueen will be fulfilled following in his footsteps. I think what brought the film down a few notches was its use of the supporting cast. All the familiar faces from the franchise are nearly non-existent, so where they feel like cardboard cutouts there to make a quick cameo and not actually contribute to the film. And the new characters just weren't that strong or distinct. They lacked the compelling characterization of the first, which made the third film a bit emptier and somewhat underwhelming overall.
We want to fight bad guys. I get what you meant.
Coming in at number 24, we have Incredibles 2. This is actually a movie I enjoyed quite a bit when I first saw it in theaters. After waiting over a decade to revisit these characters, and with the first film ending on such a perfect sequel tease, I was just happy to be back in this world. Even then though, I remember feeling like it wasn't anywhere near the level of the original, and after revisiting it for this ranking, it's honestly the movie that dropped the most for the both of us. Unlike some of the films below it, I don't think Incredibles 2 is bad. The problem is that it's just kind of mid. There aren't many glaring flaws, but there also aren't many standout strengths. What made the first Incredibles so special wasn't just that it was a great superhero movie, but it was an even better family movie. Every member of the Parr family had a meaningful role to play, and the story constantly reinforced those relationships. Here, that family dynamic feels notably absent, and the characters spend so much of the film separated that they barely feel like a unit at all. The movie also falls into the similar pattern that I've stated a lot of other Pixar sequels sometimes struggle with, and that's promoting a supporting character into the lead role. The thing is, I actually think focusing on Helen was the right idea. She's a great character and there was plenty of potential there, flipping the focus from the dad to the mom for the sequel. The issue is that Bob, Violet, and Dash just feel way too sidelined in the process. On top of that, the Screenslaver storyline wasn't terrible, but it's just a fairly standard superhero plot. The twist is predictable, and the villain's motivations never connect to the themes or characters in a way like how Syndrome's did in the first film. That said, it's still a decent watch. Edna Mode remains as one of Pixar's best side characters and made the most of her appearance here. Frozone is just as likable in this as the first, and there's some pretty entertaining action sequences throughout. But in the end, Incredibles 2 never feels like a sequel that truly justified its existence, especially when it's following up one of Pixar's very best films.
I want to talk to you, device.
Please, call me Lily.
So here at number 23, we have Pixar's most recent release, Toy Story 5. This movie has gotten some pretty solid reviews, but for us, it just didn't really hit. I I think it's pretty comfortably the weakest film in the franchise, and that doesn't mean it's terrible, as Toy Story has just been pretty remarkably consistent. But like any sequel, it ultimately has to justify its existence, and after the truly perfect ending of Toy Story 3, that's a huge mountain to climb. And I'd sadly have to say, a mountain they failed to climb with both of their follow-up films post Toy Story 3. This is also another Pixar sequel that feels more like a TV special than a theatrical film, and it falls into that same pattern I've talked about throughout these rankings of sidelining the main character to focus on a supporting one. Woody barely drives the story here and almost feels just along for the ride, while Jessie, who's always been more of a tertiary character, completely takes over as the central focus. And I do like Jessie, but when the foundation of this franchise has been always so built around Woody, that shift just feels pretty jarring, especially considering just how much Woody and some of the others were sidelined. I actually think the opening with all the Buzz Lightyears crash landing on the island was bold and did its job of making me curious about how it would tie into the main story, but for me, that payoff never really came together in a satisfying way and just felt kind of random. My biggest issue though is the villain. Lilypad and the whole idea of children becoming overly dependent on tablets and technology is actually a pretty interesting direction for a Toy Story movie. The problem is that it never really goes beyond the surface. It feels like the film introduces an interesting theme without fully exploring it, which I totally believe that old Toy Story would've. And so I'd have to say that Lilypad is easily the weakest and most underdeveloped villain in the franchise for me, when she genuinely had potential to be really great. And I'd also admit that some of the callbacks just didn't work for me. Moments like Buzz saying "we're flying with style" didn't feel nostalgic. They just reminded me of how much this franchise is leaning on and even milking dry what came before instead of creating some new iconic moments. And for what's usually Pixar's funniest franchise, the humor felt surprisingly flat, especially with characters like Mr. Potato Head, Ham, and Rex once again playing much smaller roles than they did in the first 3 films. That said, there were still a few bright spots. Smarty Pants, voiced by Conan O'Brien, was a fun addition, and the moment where Jessie learns Emily named her daughter after her genuinely felt like something that could have come from prime Pixar. I did think that was a pretty great moment. So no, I don't think this movie is bad, and I definitely don't think you're crazy if you enjoyed it, but for me, the best word to describe it is just fine. And for a Toy Story movie, that's pretty disappointing.
I suffer from short-term memory loss.
Coming in at number 22 is Finding Dory. I remember when this came out, so many were obsessed with how cute Baby Dory is, and during my rewatch, the second Baby Dory appeared on screen, I was reminded of how valid those responses were. Baby Dory really is adorable. But the Cars franchise tried to center their sidekick Mater in Cars 2, and it just did not work. Dory moving from sidekick to the lead worked better in this film. Similar to its predecessor, Finding Nemo, Finding Dory continues to make Dory a character you can really feel for and root for as she navigates short-term memory loss with plucky determination. And I like the way she pieced together memories throughout the film. Bringing the familiar fish faces to an aquarium was a smart new environment, as the first explores the vast ocean, and now they explore a more contained aquatic space. They executed several fun action moments within the aquarium, like the funny and intense sequence when the fish had to evade the kids' hands that shot into the water like missiles. I like the way this film still centers around needing to find family, as now Dory seeks to find her family with Marlin and Nemo's help. I do think Marlin and Nemo were way too sidelined in the film, and their B story felt like just giving them a pretty one-note thing to do just to occupy some time, which was a pity because they're great characters when fleshed out in Finding Nemo. The Finding Nemo franchise is good at characterizing all the different sea creatures they come across, and while the new characters aren't as memorable as Bruce and Crush and the fish tank crew in Finding Nemo, they still have presence and humor in Finding Dory. The octopus works well in his role, and it was a nice touch to show the whale friends that Dory can communicate with through her skill of speaking whale. It was heartwarming to learn Dory's parents had continued to put shells down, hoping Dory would find her way home, and then I like the final scene where Dory notes that their ocean view is unforgettable, as Unforgettable plays over the credits. While Finding Dory isn't as good of a follow-up as some of the others that will be showing up higher on this list, it still has its moments to shine, even if all in all, it's a bit middling.
Do you know where I could find a beaver?
Coming in at number 21, we have one of Pixar's most recent releases, Hoppers. I did enjoy this movie, although I will say that it's definitely one that dropped for me on a rewatch. What I'll say is that Hoppers does have a really strong concept. It feels like something that could absolutely live in the classic Pixar wheelhouse, as on a purely conceptual level, it's fun, imaginative, and full of potential. But for me, it ultimately lands as solid new Pixar rather than classic era Pixar because the execution just doesn't fully match the idea. I did enjoy the animal world they built with the pond ecosystem and rules, and the way that the different creatures had their own roles within the larger hierarchy. George is also a very likable new character, and the idea of animal kings is a genuinely fun direction for the story to go in. Plus, the moment where Mabel kills the insect queen was bold, and the caterpillar successor son stepping in as new villain worked for me in regard to the plot and comedic purposes. There's also a lot of small touches I appreciated, like the comedic animal behavior bits, and the way that the animation for the animals shifts when their translated speech is removed. It makes the world feel more lived in and adds some nice perspective perspective. And Vanessa Bayer as the shark was a great casting choice that definitely made for one of the highlights of the film. But despite all of that, the story itself just doesn't feel as tight or emotionally resonant as Pixar at its best. The film has a great playground, but it just doesn't quite build a story that fully maximizes it. I kept thinking that with a concept this strong, we would have seen Pixar at its peak turn this into something more focused, more character-driven, and more emotionally rewarding. I also wish more of the animal cast felt more memorable beyond George and the shark, and the human characters don't quite land as anything beyond plot function, outside of Jerry of course, who I think was solid, but outside of him, the other human scientists just do what they need to do, but they don't really feel like fully lived in or memorable characters. I would go as far to say that this is a good movie, but I just don't quite see it as a return to form like some people have described it as. To me, it's a solid entry that just doesn't reach the higher emotional and storytelling peaks the concept suggests it could have hit, especially if it had come out under the studio during its strongest era.
Bruno. Yeah, I get one too sometimes.
At number 20 is Luca. The word that always comes to mind when I think of Luca is charming. It's a sweet and simple story and feels more like a short film despite being about an hour and a half long. The above-water animation is lovely and feels like a nice love letter to beautiful Italy. Unfortunately, the underwater animation left a lot to be desired. Despite coming out 18 years after Finding Nemo, the ocean in Luca felt more flat and dated than Finding Nemo's stunning ocean animation. And it didn't feel like it was intentionally shallow water animation either. The water felt unrealistically stagnant, and for introducing a world of humanoid sea creatures, it could have been cool if the underwater sequences really felt like a developed, immersive world instead of just a stale block of blue. Luca and Alberto's dynamic is cool, and I like the humorous way they depict Alberto thinking he's a human expert and yet getting so much wrong about the human world. The Silencio Bruno phrase as an exploration of silencing self-doubt was impactful, and I also felt Ercole was a good and funny antagonist for this film. Julia was likable, and I liked seeing her dad come to care about Alberto after Alberto was abandoned by his own family. The new Pixar era seemed to be experimenting a lot more with its animation style, some more successful than others, and this was one of the times where the change in animation worked well enough to match the film's vibe. Luca perhaps could have benefited from more depth and development for the characters and world to be ranked higher on this list, but overall there's nothing wrong with this film. It was just a little thin and linear, and maybe would have been even better as a short film. But for being one of Pixar's most contained and simple stories, Luca was a nice and enjoyable experience.
You're a bear!
Coming in at number 19, we have Pixar's 2012 film, Brave. Revisiting this one, I wasn't entirely sure how it'd feel, but I definitely did end up enjoying it. It takes a little while to fully win you over, but eventually it does land for me in that solid Pixar tier. At the time of its release, Brave was definitely considered one of Pixar's weaker films, really only sitting above Cars 2 for most, but that context matters. It came out after a run of some of the most consistently strong animated films ever made, so the bar was incredibly high. And after years of new Pixar releases, it's definitely really far from one of their weakest entries anymore. The core concept isn't quite as fresh or immediately impressive as Pixar at its peak, but the execution of Merida's story still works. Her desire to break free from the gendered expectations placed on her and control her own fate is clearly established, and moments like her choosing to shoot for herself with the bow at the beginning are still really effective and iconic character beats. The family dynamic is also pretty well set up. You understand exactly where Merida and her parents stand in their beliefs, and the tension between individuality is grounded and primed for some good emotional resonance. That said, the early portion of the film doesn't feel quite as immediately gripping or conceptually striking as some of Pixar's stronger openings, which they're known for. For me, the film really starts to click once the mother transforms into the bear. That shift notably elevates the entire story from a relatively standard or done before mother-daughter conflict into something more specific and uniquely Pixar. The whole mother-bear metaphor is genuinely strong, with the idea of placing the mother's rigid, regal identity into this bigger, chaotic, and untamed beast. It's really smart and effective storytelling and totally works as the emotional engine of the film. The arc of their relationship ultimately becomes the heart of the movie, and I actually think the final act is stronger than I remembered. The stakes feel pretty intense in full circle, especially with the history between the family and the bears, and the urgency of reversing the spell before it becomes permanent gives the story real momentum. That said, while it's solid, it does take a while to really elevate the story. The emotional beats are there, but it's not necessarily a guaranteed tearjerker, and it lacks those standout defining moments you associate with the studio at its best. So while I wouldn't call it great Pixar, it comfortably sits in that good to solid Pixar tier.
I am not a toy, I'm a sport.
We're giving our number 18 spot to Toy Story 4. When I heard Toy Story would be returning for a fourth film after perfectly closing out the franchise with Toy Story 3, my immediate thought was that this film is going to have to be pretty excellent to justify existing. And then the film came out and it was just decent. Not a bad film at all, but not worth lessening Toy Story's perfect track record with its last 3 films. Toy Story 4's animation, however, was excellent, and it's one of Pixar's most aesthetically pleasing and impressively animated films. It was a fun idea to bring the toys to a carnival, and I liked how the environment glowed at night. I I like the creepy vibe of Gabby Gabby and her ventriloquist dummies. The quest to take another's toy box seemed to be good dark stakes, although a bit contrived. But then they made it seem like taking a voice box is actually not a big deal, which sort of deflated the suspense. Gabby Gabby was yet another case of an antagonist who's mostly well-meaning, and I prefer the more memorable and sinister antagonist of the first 3 films. But Gabby Gabby helping the lost little girl at the end was a cute and moving development. On a rewatch, the new side characters are better than I remember. Forky has some good comedic timing, Bo isn't as generic as I remember, and Duke Kaboom and his backstory was pretty hilarious. It was also nice to have Key and Peele reunite as prized plushies, although their animation did feel like it didn't belong in the Toy Story franchise as much. The rest of the supporting cast felt really sidelined, which was a shame because the toys in the Toy Story franchise are some of Pixar's best characters. They even sidelined Buzz, which felt odd to do to a once prominent character. Although, the recurring bit about Buzz contemplating his inner voice wasn't awful, just half-baked. Each Toy Story film examines the themes of purpose, and I did appreciate how Toy Story 4 approached the concept of lost toys and how Woody too felt lost but ended the film with a new sense of direction. It was nice to see Woody choosing to find his own purpose rather than just living to serve a kid. And the Forky existential crisis thing also reflected themes of purpose, with him first rejecting, then embracing his existence. Forky's role did feel a bit disconnected from the rest of the film, but he worked better on a rewatch. For a Woody-centric send-off and an attempt to explain what happens to toys when they retire or are no longer played with, the film did a good job overall. I still just feel like Toy Story had the perfect trilogy, and it didn't need this film to be added to that.
Orange? Who made the console orange?
Coming in at number 17, we have Inside Out 2. I enjoyed Inside Out 2 on my first watch, but I did have a few critiques, and interestingly, on my second viewing, I actually liked it more and found myself questioning those criticisms less, which was usually the opposite when doing these rankings. And so because of that, I'd confidently place it as one of Pixar's stronger sequels, which is definitely something the studio has historically struggled with. What makes it work is that it understands exactly how to expand its world. The core concept of Inside Out is already extremely strong, and moving into Riley's teenage years is the perfect natural progression. And the choice to introduce new emotions like anxiety, envy, embarrassment, boredom, and nostalgia feel not just fun, but also the exact right choices for this stage of life. Anxiety in particular works really well as the central force of this film. It's such a great choice as the new antagonistic emotion for joy in the way that sadness was in the first film, and also just makes a ton of sense for a new teenager. The movie also does a really strong job of showing just how much anxiety can spiral when it goes unchecked. Plus, the anxiety attack sequence is especially effective and well done. Definitely one of the emotional highlights of the film. I also love the introduction of the sense of self along with the belief system visualized through those webs. Just some great notable standout ideas. And then the whole I'm not good enough collapse later in the film ties that concept together in a really satisfying way, with how Riley tried to suppress core parts of who she is to fit in, and that being the result. And like the first film, how the emotional journey in Riley's head mirrors what she's experiencing externally remains one of the franchise's strongest storytelling tools. And the mind world is also just so fun and expanded in fun ways here, with the vaults, the stream of thoughts, and even the construction and remodeling style arrival of the new emotions all add great texture to the world. My only real critique on rewatch is that the scale feels notably smaller compared to the first film. Instead of moving, changing schools, and major family conflict for Riley, we're mostly contained within her hockey camp, which all takes place in like a weekend, which just on paper feels less intense. But on rewatch, that didn't bother me as much as it initially did. Ultimately, it just comes down to other films in this range having higher highs or more impactful overall execution. Like how even Inside Out 1 had some notably more impactful emotional moments that I think landed harder and more effectively.
The count's off.
At number 16, we've got Soul. Soul is a concept that I really liked. The execution, not as much. Though the film did feel better on a rewatch, and it does have one of my favorite messages of all time, which is that your passion isn't your purpose. That left a lasting mark on me because so often we think that the passions we pursue are what gives us purpose, and if we don't succeed in our passion, we've missed out on our purpose. When really, life's value is so often found in the little things and the less flashy aspects of existence that are still beautiful and profound. Soul did a nice job communicating that. I like the sense of culture infused into the film, and jazz was a great choice to reflect the improvisation of life. The opal aesthetic of The Great Before is really lovely and creative. There were some humorous historical jokes, which I feel would probably go over a lot of little kids' heads. I feel like this film is reflective of new Pixar's struggle to make a film that appeals to all ages. In some of their 2020s films, they'd either make parts too goofy and childish, or so mature that it feels like only adults would appreciate it. Old Pixar was really good at catering to both audiences cohesively, whereas movies like Soul tend to dip in and out of kiddie humor and mature themes with less finesse. But when they commit to their mature tone, I like it, especially the message in the fish and water story. I also wasn't crazy about the body swap storyline with the cat, and just knowing that animated films have a history of not letting black characters inhabit their own bodies, this, in a much less egregious way, still felt like a version of that. Joe and 22 aren't the most memorable Pixar duo, but they work well enough, and I like Jamie Foxx and Tina Fey's vocal performances. Terry was good in serving his role too. There were some nice visual metaphors like what it looks like to be in the zone or to be a lost soul, even though I do feel like they could have had even more development and exploration of the afterlife or before life. Like, despite being much vaster than the inside of a young girl's mind, the inner world of Inside Out felt more developed and dimensional. As for the end, while I don't mind Joe getting a second chance at life and deciding he's going to be more present after learning to appreciate the little things throughout the film, I still think it might have hit harder if Joe instead accepted that his life was what it was, and it wasn't as stagnant as he thought, and then he goes on to find fulfillment as a mentor to the new souls. It felt completely like they were setting that up with him being a teacher and then helping 22. Again, Joe deciding to love every bit of his life at the end is nice, but I think he should have been ready to love every bit of his afterlife rather than just do some rushed reversal at the end. Especially because a lot of people would love a second chance at life, but usually that second chance isn't a perfect, literal reset, but rather making the most of your new circumstances. So to me, the film's message would have felt even more powerful if Joe's fresh start was in the afterlife. But even so, the film was still a nice, introspective look into what it means to be a soul.
Barley, I'm trying to take care of you and Dad.
Coming in at number 15, we have what I'd argue is one of Pixar's most underrated films, Onward. I enjoyed this on my first watch, and I mostly remember the ending standing out above everything else, but on rewatch I realized there's a lot more working here than I initially gave it credit for. Again, one thing I've always appreciated about Pixar is when they bring a level of emotional maturity to what are technically kids' films, and Onward is a really strong example of that. The world building alone is a great hook, with the idea that magic used to exist but has slowly been replaced by the convenience of modern technology. It's just a really clever, very Pixar-style way of commenting on the real world. And the central premise is also just strong storytelling. Two brothers who lost their father at a young age being given one last chance to spend a day with him, and when the spell goes wrong halfway through, they have to go on a journey with just their father's legs to find this MacGuffin and complete the spell. And while the dad's legs are only able to have partial presence due to the botched spell, they still somehow manage to give them so much personality and feel like a real character along for the ride. But at its core, this is really a brother or sibling story. The way both Ian and Barley have processed grief so differently and how that shapes who they are now gives the film a surprisingly grounded emotional weight. Moments like when they dance with their father's legs, or the reveal about Barley not being able to say goodbye to their dad when he was sick, all land because the character writing is so clear and well done. But it is still definitely the ending that elevates the film for me so much. The choice and mature restraint not to give Ian the final moment with his dad, but instead let Barley have it while Ian watches, is a very bold emotional twist that just works so well. Along with the realization that Barley has essentially been the father figure in his life all along, gives the film real emotional closure, and it's one of the few Pixar endings that still made my eyes water on a rewatch. That said, it's definitely not without flaws. The side storyline with the mom and the Manticore feels more like standard animated adventure vibes, and parts of the journey don't feel as memorable as the concept suggests. Like outside of the Walk of Faith, which was great, for an animated fantasy adventure film, there's not that many truly memorable or creative sequences that stand out. Even the whole dragon made from the school at the end wasn't like amazing, and plus while the emotional payoff is extremely strong, the world itself can feel a bit small for such a high concept genred idea. But overall, if you have siblings, especially an older brother or sister, this one is probably still going to land very well.
This party is for scarce students only.
Coming in at number 14 is Monsters University. What a delight this film was. We didn't remember how good it was until we rewatched it for this ranking. For some reason in the past, I had remembered it as sorta average, but it's actually a true Pixar quality film that I thoroughly enjoyed. Mike Wazowski is one of Pixar's strongest and most memorable characters, so it was smart to build the prequel around him. The college environment was fun and well developed, and reminded that the Monsters Inc. / Monsters University franchise is one of the best at world building, and also one of the more genuinely comedic, as there was lots of nice humor in this movie. I'd say it's one of Pixar's funniest films. I liked Mike being a studious underdog and Sully being a legacy jock. Monsters University affirmed that Mike and Sully are one of Disney's best duos, and I like how they become friends and bond over their admiration for the scare profession. The film had a compelling approach to the brains versus bronze conflict. Mike had the knowledge and the work ethic, but Sully had the natural talent. And I like how the film depicts that even if you don't have as much talent in one area, you can still find lots of value in your own unique strengths. They organically illustrate how through trying to be a scarer, Mike actually had great skill as a coach. The prequel did a good job giving each of the characters distinction, heart, and humor. And unlike Incredibles 2, where the animation of the new superheroes felt out of place, all the new monsters felt true to the original's vibe. The Dean was intimidating, the Uzma Kappa frat group were legitimately funny and likable, And they even nicely set up Randall's villain arc without it being heavy-handed. Each of the competitions were creative and a good time, and I especially liked that the final competition brought back one of the most unique elements of the first film, which was the simulation room. This is a film that keeps you entertained from the first act to the third. I love the line Sally says to Mike about how Mike isn't scary, but he is fearless. And then it's great seeing how they got kicked out of school, but they went on to work in the Monsters Inc. mailroom, where we already know they'll work the way up to being the best duo in the business. Seeing Mike go from being little and told he can't cross that line on the scare floor to getting to cross it as a coach was great. Mike and Sully have always been great, likable, well-developed characters, and Monsters University certainly did them justice with this really well-done film.
It's you who need us!
Coming in at number 13, we'd have what I'd argue is the most underrated Pixar film, and that's the studio's second ever feature, A Bug's Life. I said earlier that Onward is one of Pixar's most underrated films, but I think A Bug's Life might top that. This is a really strong entry, and I don't think it gets enough credit for helping establish Pixar as a top-tier animation studio right after the massive success of Toy Story. There's really a lot to like here, starting with the concept, using ants and grasshoppers to explore ideas of class structure, exploitation, and revolution, is just a great storytelling foundation, and one that works for both kids and adults without feeling overly simplified or overly complicated. I do think part of its legacy got notably affected by the whole ant situation, where DreamWorks released a very similar concept around the same time, which probably diluted how original this idea felt in audience reception and like the cultural conversation around it. But beyond that, Flick works well as a protagonist here. He's flawed yet likable and consistently drives the story forward well. The circus bugs are also a fun addition, giving the film a strong comedic side while still feeding into the main plot of deception and performance. If anything holds it back slightly compared to higher-ranked Pixar films, it's that those supporting elements, while entertaining, aren't quite as conceptually strong or emotionally layered as what we see in other Pixar films at their peak. But one of the biggest strengths here that is on the level of Pixar at its peak is its villain, Hopper. Even with relatively limited screen time, he's a genuinely intimidating antagonist. Every time the grasshoppers appear, there's a real sense of danger and power imbalance, which keeps the stakes present, clear, and suspenseful. Really one of Pixar's best villains to this date. And also, I'd say that the third act really delivers. The fake bird sequence going wrong and the escalation into the threat of the real bird gives the film a genuinely tense and satisfying climax. It's one of those Pixar endings that leans into both spectacle and emotional payoff in a way that still holds up. So overall, this is a film that shows a lot of early Pixar storytelling maturity. It deals with heavy ideas in a really fun, accessible way, and while it might not get talked about as much as the studio's other classics, it absolutely belongs with them.
Pete stop.
At the respectable number 12 is Cars. So Cars is interesting because for years I always thought of it as being one of the first Pixar films that dipped in quality. But when I rewatched it this year, it really is better than I remember, and even if among the Pixar greats it's not the strongest, it still does deserve to be considered one of the Pixar greats. I like the colorful and sleek animation and the electric movement of the race cars. They definitely made the most of the anthropomorphic car world with fun ideas and characters. Also, Rascal Flatts' cover of Life is a Highway is just the perfect sound to go along with this film. Lightning McQueen is a solid protagonist, and having a race car be the actual athlete was cool. I also like the way he ends up in Radiator Springs. It connected to his flaw of always being in a rush since he made his driver Mac keep driving late into the night even when he was exhausted. And with McQueen always being in a rush, it makes him landing in the sleepy town of Radiator Springs a nice contrast as the cocky, flashy car has to learn how to slow down and appreciate the simple things. And Mater surprised me during my rewatch because he was actually funny in his sidekick role and had some good lines. From the thoughtful, no need to know where I'm going, just need to know where I've been, to hilariously telling the media, I ain't bragging, but I was in charge of hunting McQueen down when he tried to escape. That was the joke that probably made me laugh out loud more than any other jokes during my Pixar films rewatch. I think because of Cars 2 and how Mater has been sort of flanderized and overused over the years, I always thought of him as just obnoxious and kiddie, but he had more fleshed out characterization in Cars than I remembered. The cast of characters in the folksy town have nice, distinct characterizations, and they did a good job making the town have rural charm. It felt like an organic task for McQueen to have to stay and fix the road he ruined, and I believe McQueen really did come to love the town and Sally. I especially like Doc Hudson and how he's the jaded former race car who can teach McQueen a thing or two. He's a good mirror to the protagonist, and there's some real heart and intrigue to their dynamic. It was interesting to learn that Doc called the news and media to come take McQueen away, and then how the Radiator Springs cars show up to help McQueen with his big race. And that moment when Guido has his chance to show how elite he is when he changes McQueen's tires is such a great moment. It's one of my favorite parts. I like that Lightning McQueen wins through sportsmanship rather than directly getting the trophy, and how he sees Doc and the Dynaco vet. It was nice too that McQueen helped put Radiator Springs back on the map. I feel like Cars did a good job of telling a common story of a flashy fish out of water in ways that were thoughtful, humorous, and well-developed.
Welcome to the land of your ancestors.
Coming in just outside of the top 10 at number 11, we have Coco. This is really just a testament to how strong Pixar's catalog is, because Coco is a genuinely beautiful and top-tier animated film. Looking at the films we have above it, it's just hard to crack that upper tier, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone had this in their personal top 10. What makes Coco work so well is how it fully integrates its culture into the actual storytelling. The concept of the ofrenda being such a fun and clever driver of the plot, with the way it's used for character motivation and reveals, is brilliant, and the world building in the Land of the Dead is some of Pixar's most visually appealing and thematically rich work. That said, one reason it doesn't quite break into our top 10 is that the Hector twist was somewhat predictable on first watch. I had a sense of where it was going early on, and the film does sit on hiding that reveal for a while, but even then, I'm not really mad at it because the journey itself, especially the dynamic between Miguel and Hector, is just so well done that it doesn't really rely too much on that twist to carry the film. There are also genuinely high stakes with this premise in a way that's pretty dark for a family film. The idea that being forgotten means you essentially cease to exist in the afterlife is a brilliant but intense emotional concept, and the film does a great job at exploring the fear of erasure and what it truly means to be remembered. And the way that theme pays off perfectly through the song Remember Me, which is probably the strongest original Pixar song in my opinion, is just pretty special. The way the song evolves from Ernesto's upbeat performance to Hector's more personal version with Coco, and finally Miguel using it as an emotional bridge at the end when singing it to Coco to help her remember Hector, is just masterful setup and payoff, as well as thematic storytelling. It's one of those rare moments where the music, plot, and character arcs blend together so perfectly to create this super emotional resolution. Also, Ernesto does work well as a villain, with a backstory and presence that's strong and fits the story's themes. And even if he's not the most memorable villain Pixar's ever done, he is definitely one of the most trifling. But again, with Coco, it's the ending that just absolutely delivers, up there with Pixar's best, and everything lands exactly how they should. Definitely one of Pixar's most effective tearjerker endings that easily still holds up on a rewatch.
I don't want to play with you anymore.
We're kicking off the top 10 with Toy Story 2 at number 10. When talking about rare cases of great sequels in film, you gotta talk about Toy Story 2. This is such a good movie. It expands the world all while maintaining the great elements of the first film, especially when exploring Toy Story's signature themes of what defines purpose. They bring back all the characters and keep them interesting and active rather than just feeling like hollow shells of themselves like in some other sequels. I like that they get right into the plot with Woody quickly being stolen by a toy collector at the family yard sale. Al, as the shady, slimy toy collector, is memorable in his role, and he made a good overarching villain. And then Stinky Pete as the surprise villain is even better, and his motives work as he wasn't the most sought after toy and he doesn't want to go back into storage. There were lots of great ideas, and their execution was great too, like Woody meeting other toys from his toy line and the rest of the gang trying to find Woody and landing in a toy store. The search mission was fun, and this was an example of a Pixar film with a very good A and B story. It's also such a satisfying sequence when the elderly man fixes up Woody, and it's symbolic to paint over the Andy underneath his boot. It depicts how Woody was made new, but also was losing the personal touches that made him special. I like the central conflict for Woody of wrestling with whether it's better to be an in-use toy or a pristine collectible. There was a meaningful message as Woody discovers his lore and that he's widely beloved, and then comes to embrace that being personally loved by Andy and his friends is better than just being admired from a glass case in a museum. The new additions to the core cast are really good, with Mrs. Potato Head, Bullseye, and Jessie. It's effective how initially Jessie seems really bitter about Woody still having Andy, and then we learn during an emotional montage that she still feels a lot of pain about being donated by her owner, Emily. It's heartbreaking when she reflects on how toys never forget their kids, but their kids forget them. It also adds to Woody's dilemma of going to Japan or going back to Andy, where there's a shelf life on Andy playing with him. They had several funny nods to classic films like Rex in the car mirror referencing Jurassic Park and Zurg being Buzz's father like Star Wars. I like how they introduce a new Buzz who yet again doesn't realize he's a toy, and how the original Buzz now gets to see what that looks like. And the gag of new Buzz playing catch with his former nemesis turned dad was great. And then the film has a fun action-packed Act 3 taking place at an airport. Stinky Pete ending up with a little girl who was sure to ruin his collectible condition was funny, and Woody got to have a real deal Woody's Finest Hour adventure with the plane sequence. It's crazy how this movie almost didn't get to see the light of day when a massive amount of its animated files got accidentally deleted. But thanks to one person having copies saved on their home computer, they were able to rescue the film. Thank goodness, because Toy Story 2 is one of Pixar's best.
Coming in at number 9, we have Ratatouille. This is another film I wouldn't be mad at anyone having even higher on their list, But at this point, we're really in that tier of just masterful Pixar storytelling at its peak. What makes Ratatouille so strong is just how perfectly it executes its core concept, taking an underdog protagonist like a rat and placing him in the one environment you'd think he'd never belong in or would like to see him in. That being a kitchen is such a simple but brilliant setup, and the film does a great job at constantly leaning into that tension that this concept poses. There's genuine suspense all throughout this movie that I'd almost forgotten about. Every time Remy or the other rats are forced to navigate human spaces, there's this constant anxiety underneath it, because you know just how catastrophic it would be if they were discovered. And that tone and foreboding stakes are established immediately in the beginning with that chaotic encounter with the old woman, showing just how dangerous the human world is for them. But at the same time, the film also creates a ton of emotional and thematic depth around food and creativity. Paris is beautifully animated and feels like its own character, and the entire film truly feels like a love letter to cooking. The way they use animation to almost feel the smells and flavors, like how Remy experiences food, adds a ton of texture to the film in a really unique way. I also love how the spirit of Gusteau functions as a guiding presence for Remy throughout the film, almost like a manifestation of Remy's internal voice or conscience. It adds a nice layer to his journey and decision making, as it's Gusteau's famous line, "Anyone could cook," that's the central theme of the film. And on the antagonist side, you actually get not only one but two really strong forces. Skinner works well as a more immediate comedic threat in a cat and mouse dynamic with Linguini and Remy, while Anton Ego is this quiet, intimidating force who represents judgment and dream killing itself. Right from the great opener, you just feel how the idea that a single review can carry that much power, and it's such a great way to raise the stakes in a story about food. But at the center of it, the Remy and Linguini duo is one of Pixar's most underrated partnerships. The rat under the chef's hat concept is unique and is executed so well that it remains one of the studio's most iconic and memorable visuals. Plus, the ending absolutely sticks the landing. The Ratatouille dish triggering Ego's memory and bringing him back to his childhood is one of Pixar's most effective emotional payoffs, and the way it expands on the film's core theme of anyone can cook, as not just that anyone can learn to cook, but that greatness can come from anywhere, is just chef's kiss. The reason it sits at number 9 though is that while Linguini works, he is easily the weaker half of the central duo, and compared to the films above it, this just doesn't quite reach the same emotional peak or conceptual ceiling, even though it operates at an extremely high level.
10 seconds to self-destruct.
Our number 8 spot goes to the masterpiece, WALL-E. WALL-E is not just a beautiful and powerful Pixar film, but a beautiful and powerful contribution to cinema as a whole. The animation is striking, the wordless storytelling in the beginning is so effective, and it feels like Pixar managed to tell one of its most human stories all through a beloved robot. The film really makes you love a robot that hardly talks by employing great visual characterization. WALL-E's loneliness is palpable, but so is his ability to find beauty even in a desolate world. It really effectively communicated how good and special things can be found even in the most barren of places, so long as you choose to treat it as special. I like the way Eve shows up and the dynamics she and WALL-E have and develop over time. Like, without being strictly about their love story, the film still told one of the sweetest love stories between WALL-E and Eve and didn't even need to use many words. The contrasting temperaments worked as well as their contrasting design. The film did a great job exploring the difference between programming and purpose. The robots and even the humans thought they were meant to just do what they were programmed to do, and WALL-E showed them their ultimate purpose is to be present and find the things and people they love and treat them as valuable. It's sweet that they tie that back later in the film when Eve says directive and holds WALL-E's hand. Eve was on Earth to see if life was left on the planet, and she didn't just find it in a plant, but in a robot with so much humanity, WALL-E. I respect that the animation and idea felt creative and mature, and it's definitely Pixar's most compelling movie that takes place in space. They trusted that their audience would understand without over-explaining, and they tackled some genuinely important themes with effective commentary on humans' neglect of the Earth and of themselves. I feel the film reminded audiences of the importance of tending to the Earth and being present without being preachy. The robots have distinctive attributes, and the film really immerses you in the environment. The sequence where WALL-E and Eve move through the stars in space as dancing is defined is just such a special piece of animation and storytelling. It was sweet to see WALL-E both literally help them get back to Earth and help them remember to be human. And then it's legitimately sad and dramatic when it appears like WALL-E's been reset to just serve a singular directive of making trash cubes. I love that it's holding Eve's hand that brings WALL-E back to himself after wanting that handhold from the start. It emphasizes that life is found through connection. I appreciate WALL-E for being a creative and compelling story about a robot designed to clean up the trash the humans left, and amid that trash, he found beauty and life. And then, through an adventurous space journey, he helped remind others and us to be good to the Earth, too.
Are you in need of any assistance today, sir?
Coming in at number 7 on our list, we have Up. And yes, it's purely a coincidence that it happens to be 7 Up. But man, do I love this film. Even compared to the rest of Pixar's strong catalog and the ones we still have above it, this is easily my top 3 that I personally hold near and dear, because it really does contain some of the highest highs that the studio has ever produced. And to get it out of the way, the opening is still, in my opinion, the best opening Pixar has ever done. It's a masterclass in efficient storytelling. In just a few minutes, it establishes character, theme, and emotional history in a way that fully invests you in Carl's journey immediately. It also goes to a level of emotional maturity you rarely see in an animation, even including Pixar, dealing with loss and fertility and the passing of Ellie in a way that feels honest without being exploitative. And so by the time we reach Carl alone, you completely understand his grief and why he's closed himself off from the world. And that's what makes the rest of the film so satisfying, and getting to watch that emotional armor slowly break down. But one of the criticisms over the years is that the opening overshadows everything else that comes after, and that the rest of the film is only fine by comparison. And I definitely don't fully agree with that. I do think the second act is the weakest part of the film relative to its own standards, but it's still really strong on its own. Carl and Russell work incredibly well together, and Russell is a great foil to Carl's emotional isolation. Their dynamic carries a lot of the film's heart in the middle stretch, even when the story shifts into more traditional adventure territory. Kevin and the chase with Charles Muntz also gives the film clear stakes, and Muntz himself is a genuinely effective and intimidating antagonist. But the reason this film does sit just outside of our top 5 is ultimately because its opening and its emotional payoffs are so strong that Act 2, having basically any flaws, does feel slightly more noticeable in comparison. The bar is just set that high at this point. But again, when the film does land its moments, it really lands them. Carl discovering Ellie's adventure book updates is one of Pixar's most beautifully executed sequences. It's simple, mature, and devastatingly emotional. Even later with Carl letting go of the house, only for the audience but not Carl to realize it has arrived at Paradise Falls after all, like in the picture, is just another perfect example of Pixar trusting the audience and showing real narrative restraint. Even the moments like the return of the grape soda pen and Carl giving it to Russell as his badge at the ceremony is emotional and story gold. In the final scene, just sitting on the curb playing a simple game together feels like the perfect callback and thematic landing point about valuing the ordinary moments we share with people. And I can't really move on without mentioning the amazing score, which honestly might be the best in all of Pixar. So while the second act may not quite reach the same legendary heights as the opening and the ending, the overall film is still a clear masterpiece and easily one of Pixar's best.
Okay, not what I had in mind.
Coming in at number 6 is the ambitious, moving delight that is Inside Out. This is another movie that is near and dear to my heart. I love Inside Out. The concept of feelings having feelings is excellent, and the execution is even better, and the music and animation is also memorable and moving. The story does a great job of depicting how none of the emotions are bad and they're all necessary in their own right. And then I love how they handle the central conflict between joy and sadness. It was interesting to see Joy think sadness doesn't do much but make things worse, and then come around to learn sadness is actually crucial in the end. The design of the headquarters and islands and memory orbs were all great and creative. I like the detail of Riley wearing a shirt with all the emotions' colors as a visual way to show she's composed of all of them and needs all of them. The voice actors were all perfect choices, and I like how Joy reflects a bit of toxic positivity, since she thinks things should always be happy, and if not, something is wrong. The film is rich with great mental and psychological metaphors, like fear being in charge at night and Joy trying to keep sadness in a contained circle. And the sequence of seeing inside the parents' headquarters is excellent comedy and commentary. It was smart to have Riley be going through the big change of moving because that's sure to stir up a lot of emotions. And having the mom ask Riley to just keep being their happy girl explains why Joy might feel so adamant to always be in control, because that's what's being asked of Riley. I like how they depict the events that trigger Riley to lose her islands, and how the islands fall but then get rebuilt as expanded islands that better reflect the person Riley is becoming. Some things inside her break and get brought back, and some things don't. Pixar is known for often having those moments that can make anyone at any age cry. And for me, the Pixar moment that gets me every single time is Bing Bong's sacrifice. Like, I'll be thinking, surely I'm not going to tear up this time because I've seen it multiple times by now. But nope, I get teary-eyed every time. It's something about Bing Bong cheering when Joy makes it to the top. Like, he loves Riley so much that he's more happy that he got to help her than being somber that he's essentially dying. Take her to the moon for me, okay? As he fades away just guts me every time. And I appreciate the maturity of showing that some things from our past really do just fade into oblivion. Joy being stuck down with the forgotten memories also felt like a poignant depiction of depression, where you don't just lose joyful memories, but joy itself, and it has to fight to come back. Riley running away with anger, fear, and disgust at the wheel was a good Act 3 plot point, and it was extremely resonant and powerful when they realized the biggest threat wasn't an emotion, but rather Riley becoming numb to emotions. I like how with Riley running away, she needed sadness to compel her to turn around and go home. Then it's moving when Riley returns to her parents and shares that she was trying to be happy, but she's sad and doesn't want her parents to be mad. The film really did a great job illustrating that sadness is purposeful and emotions are layered, especially with the memory orbs now showing up as multicolored. Inside Out is a masterful exploration of emotions, and I commend the way it helped many have a better understanding of their own feelings.
Okay, everybody, coast is clear.
Making it into the illustrious top 5 at number 5 is Toy Story. What a classic. For a while, Pixar was known as the animation studio that makes masterpiece after masterpiece, and that sterling reputation began from their very first feature film. Toy Story set the tone that Pixar would be a major contributor not just to animation, but to cinema. Toy Story is revolutionary, and I love that such a quality movie was the first fully computer-animated feature film. And while it's groundbreaking for its technical achievements and for being Pixar's first, those external reasons aren't why it's this high on this list. Toy Story is in this spot because it's just genuinely an excellent film from start to finish. It was such a fun and creative concept to explore the idea of toys coming to life when people aren't looking, and going limp whenever people return. I feel like this movie had everyone side-eyeing their toys for a long while. And the animation still holds up for being the first feature of its kind. Also, Randy Newman's voice and iconic songs fit perfectly with the movie. I really enjoyed Woody and Buzz's conflict and eventual friendship. They're a top-tier Pixar duo that complement and contrast each other so well. Woody's jealousy and frustration was crystal clear, and I like that he was flawed and how his flaws led to the complicated events that unfold. And the supporting cast is Pixar's best. I love all the different toys and their personalities, and I appreciate how they gave the toys more adult personalities rather than being kiddish. None of the toys feel forgettable, and they add to the film in such fun ways. It was smart to have the film's inciting incident be Andy getting a new toy for his birthday, and his favorite cowboy toy starting to feel replaced by the more modern Buzz Lightyear. I really like the idea that Buzz doesn't realize he's a toy, and his falling with style sequence is classic Pixar. It's no wonder why To Infinity and Beyond became such an iconic phrase. Sid was great as the film's antagonist. It makes total sense that the toys would view a kid who is way too rough with his toys as a menacing villain. And I actually like that Woody was antagonistic in his own way too, becoming more likable as he learned lessons throughout the film. His arc gave the film an added sense of maturity. I had a chance to read the script for Toy Story as well, and it really is one of Pixar's best written scripts, with sharp humor, great characters, and a creative metaphor for purpose and identity, both with Buzz having to embrace that he's a toy, and Woody having to embrace that he's not the sole favorite anymore. There's great stakes throughout, with Woody and Buzz ending up away from home and needing to get back before Andy's family moves, as well as Sid essentially planning to blow Buzz up with the rocket. I like the creepy and humorous vibes of the toys working together to traumatize Sid from harming them, and how Woody speaks directly to Sid both through the voice box and then with his own mouth. And then the final action-packed sequence of Woody and Buzz trying to get on the moving truck was great too. They call back to the flying with style thing in a really cool way when Buzz and Woody are in the sky together and land right in the car with Andy. And I love how it ends on Christmas Day with the toys anticipating what new toys will be added to the crew, and then finding out Andy got a puppy. This is Pixar's shortest film and one of its tightest, as it makes the most of every second with characters that remain iconic to this day.
So you got donated by this Andy, huh?
And now, at number 4, we have what we believe is the best conclusion to any trilogy of all time, Toy Story 3. This film is just an absolute powerhouse, and it gives you everything you want out of a Pixar movie, a Toy Story film, and a trilogy finale all at once. I know it's been said a million times, but it really does feel like the perfect ending and truly should have just been the end of the franchise. Not because the later films are bad, but because the ending here was just so definitive and perfect. But what makes Toy Story 3 so strong is how naturally it evolves the core themes of the series. The idea of what happens to toys when their kid grows up is something every viewer has probably wondered at some point, and setting this story at the exact moment Andy is leaving for college is a perfect narrative choice. Plus, Andy leaving for college also lining up perfectly with the original target audience from 1995 being at the age they'd be leaving for college is also just a really cool addition. And the opening setup and predicament alone is really interesting and brilliant, with having the toys locked away in storage for years, still clinging on to a sense of purpose tied to Andy. And from there, the film exploring different responses to that existential crisis. We see Woody wanting to stay loyal, while Buzz and the others start questioning their replaced in the idea of moving on. And then the group ultimately being placed in Sunnyside Daycare, which slowly reveals itself as something much darker. It's just some great stuff for this franchise's concept. And of course, we have to give praise to Lotso, who honestly might be the best villain in all of Pixar. His backstory of being replaced after being lost gives him this twisted yet understandable philosophy about being left behind by kids, which is so well done. And then the way that he presents himself as this warm leader while running Sunnyside like a dictatorship is genuinely imposing. And then by the later parts of the film, when he just becomes completely ruthless, especially in the trash fire sequence, when he's willing to let all the other toys die after everything they've done for him, they just didn't hold back at all with making Lotso genuinely terrible. This film also works incredibly well as a genre piece. It's funny in classic Toy Story fashion, with Ken being a notable standout addition in that aspect, but it also functions as this great prison break thriller as well. And ultimately, Sunnyside just feels like this fully realized world, with Big Baby, the monkey toy guard, the toy telephone. It all adds to that controlled, oppressive atmosphere. And then there are the final moments of this film, which are just perfect Pixar. The scene where the toys accept their fate in the incinerator is so dark, emotional, and genuinely terrifying, and the sudden rescue by the claw is one of the most satisfying emotional releases in the entire series, while also being a great callback to the first film. And then I don't know anyone whose eyes didn't at least start to water when Andy gives the toys to Bonnie and plays with them one last time. It's simple, emotional, and as perfect as an ending can get.
In our special third place spot, we've got none other than the powerhouse of a film, Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo really is an example of masterful storytelling. It's probably one of the most rewatched Pixar films, as it even holds the record for the best-selling DVD of all time. And there's a reason why it's so beloved. It's a genuinely epic ocean adventure that wonderfully captures the unique perspectives of a parent and child. The ocean animation is beautiful and has so much depth. The film has a very effective opener that establishes Marlin's love for his wife and unborn children and how they represent a couple eager to start their family in what they believe is a nice, safe neighborhood. And then that barracuda attack is tragic and dark and immediately makes you empathize with why Marlin is so overprotective of Nemo as his only child to survive the attack. Marlin is a great flawed protagonist as the uptight and overprotective clownfish who doesn't crack jokes like other fish assume. I feel like Finding Nemo actually has the strongest A and B story in a Pixar film, as both Marlin and Nemo's plots are really compelling. I like the layers to the title too, as Marlin has to literally find Nemo, but Nemo also finds himself when he's brought to a fish tank in a dental office. It was a great contrast to have Nemo wanting to see the world but then getting put in a confined tank, while Marlin wants to keep the world small and contained but has to travel all across the ocean to find his son. And both fish learn valuable lessons in their new territory. Dory having short-term memory loss was also an effective choice because Marlin overthinks and it riddles him with fear. Meanwhile, Dory's inability to linger on thoughts makes her more fearless. Finding Nemo fully delivers on the adventure across the ocean, and all the stops along the journey were fun and creative. I like the tank fish that Nemo meets, and how he and Gil can relate to having disabilities. Their mission to dirty the tank so they can get to the ocean worked, and Darla had a legit scary presence. Nemo thinks Marlin wouldn't look for him because he's scared of the ocean, but then it's really heartfelt when he learns from Nigel that his dad actually has been going on an epic journey to find him. So much so that he's big news around the ocean. The third act is strong, with Dory finding Nemo and not putting it together at first that he's who they've been looking for, and Marlin saying he's just trying to get home, and then directly after he finds Nemo and Dory because they're home. It was a great final obstacle to have Nemo caught in a net, and Marlin needing to trust Nemo to break out in his own way. And the ending is really sweet, as Marlin sends Nemo off on another field trip, and the tank fish make it to the ocean as the final tag. Finding Nemo has a really strong written script that came to life wonderfully. And most of all, it had solid life lessons that to this day have stuck with people, as the film reminds you that in life, sometimes you gotta just keep swimming.
Indestructible and machine washable, darling.
For our number 2 ranked Pixar film, we have The Incredibles. This film is one of the best family films ever made and also one of the best superhero films ever made. And it's basically just a perfect movie. The only real critique I'd make is that while it has a ton of emotional resonance, it doesn't quite have that single gut punch tearjerker moment that some other Pixar films are known for, but honestly it's just so strong everywhere else that it doesn't need it to still land firmly in our top 3. What stands out immediately is just how mature this film is. From the opening superhero interviews, you instantly understand this world and what's been lost. And the film fully commits to the idea of superheroes existing in this grounded society, exploring the legal, ethical, and political consequences of that in a way that's incredibly bold for an animated film. Even early on, you get moments like Mr. Incredible being sued for saving someone attempting to take their life, only to be told he interfered with the right to die. It's a surprisingly mature inclusion and immediately sets the tone for the reality that this world is built on. And then seeing Bob go from a celebrated hero to sitting in a life lifeless cubicle under a tiny controlling boss is such a strong metaphor for burnout routine and midlife frustration. Just a great tonal shift and setup. Also, that same maturity carries right into the family dynamic. Each family member has great characterization, and having their powers reflect their emotional role within the family is such a smart choice. Centering the strained marriage between Bob and Helen, along with the sense of unfulfilled potential in their lives, is handled with a level of honesty and depth that's really rare for a kids film. And then Bob's arc of secretly reliving the glory days also works as a great metaphor for a midlife crisis. Plus, I think once the family storylines collide on the island is the film at its absolute peak. Helen breaking Bob out, the kids escaping the guards, and everything eventually converging is easily one of Pixar's best long-running sequences. And then there's Syndrome, who for us is easily a Mount Rushmore Pixar villain. His transformation from superhero superfan to disillusioned adult superhero killer is dark, effective, and tied directly into the film's themes. And the fact that he's already eliminated so many of the superheroes before the movie even begins just makes him even more sinister. On top of that, you have iconic side characters like Frozone and Edna Mode, with Frozone being one of Pixar's most likable side characters, and Edna being a masterclass in how to maximize a supporting character with limited screen time. Probably my favorite minimal Pixar side character of all time. And by the end, when the family fully embraces what made them special and comes together as a unit, it feels like the perfect resolution to everything the film has been building toward. I mean, it's truly just a pretty perfect film from top to bottom.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And finally, coming in at the coveted #1 spot, we have what we believe is the best Pixar film of all time, Monsters, Inc. When putting this list together, we combined both of our rankings and made adjustments throughout, but this film never moved. Before and after rewatches, it remained #1 for both of us. To start, this is our favorite Pixar concept, and honestly our favorite concept for any animated film. The idea that monsters are actually afraid of humans but need our screams to power their world is just pure gold. It's creative, original, and instantly creates a world that you want to spend time in. And thankfully, the execution is just as good. Sully and Mike, in our opinion, are Pixar's best duo. I completely understand the Woody and Buzz argument, of course, but I personally give the edge to Sully and Mike. Sully's journey from star scarer to Boo's protector is incredibly endearing, while Mike's loyalty and friendship, but more uptight and rigid personality, while also just being an absolute punching bag throughout the film, make him one of Pixar's most consistently entertaining characters. In fact, Mike Wazowski might be my favorite Pixar character, period. And this film also does a fantastic job with stakes. You're worried about what happens to Boo if she's discovered, what happens to Sully and Mike if they're caught, and you're still somehow invested in them beating Randall and setting the scare record. Speaking of Randall, he and Waternoose form one of Pixar's strongest villain pairings. Randall's intimidating and memorable, while Waternoose's portrayal works so well because Sully genuinely admires him, and the reveal of corruption behind the company and the plan to literally extract screams from children is extremely dark and effective as well. This is also one of Pixar's funniest films, packed with great side characters and visual gags, while still being expertly paced from beginning to end. And then there's the whole door sequence in the final act, which I genuinely think is the single best action piece Pixar has ever created. It's creative, thrilling, and takes full advantage of the movie's concept and originality. But what ultimately pushes Monsters, Inc. to #1 is the ending. Sully saying goodbye to Boo is heartbreaking, but that final moment where Mike rebuilds the door and Sully hears Boo say "Kitty" one last time is just perfection. And the restraint of ending on Sully's smile rather than showing us more is exactly the right and perfect storytelling choice. And so for us, Monsters, Inc. isn't just Pixar's best film, it's the complete package when it comes to concept, characters, world building, comedy, villain, stakes, emotion, and even groundbreaking animation. It excels in every category that makes Pixar great, which is why it's our very confident #1. And not just our favorite Pixar film, but just one of our favorite films of all time.